Peta Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Here's what's coming up tonight on Credlin. With the Dunkley by-election race looking tighter every day, this is still Labor's to lose. It's a 6% margin and their popular MP died in office, so not the usual conditions. So why then does Labor look nervous, trying to manage expectations, I reckon, ahead of Saturday? Don't believe the spin or sanctimony from Andrew Twiggy Forrest, who's out again today, rubbishing nuclear power and touting his green solutions. Reality is this is all about business and where the big subsidies are, not about our energy needs or what's best for Australia. Plus, we'll cross live to the Ukraine, the capital of Kyiv, a bit later in the show for a sense of the mood on the ground. We've got Michael Danby there as the country passes its 2-year mark and no end to the war in sight. And Labor today acting holier than thou in the Parliament about their naming and shaming of companies on this issue of the so-called gender pay gap. Now, I'll point out to you shortly, you can drive a truck through these statistics, as trained economist Senator Matt Canavan pointed out.
Well, look, this gender pay report must be the most useless set of data that a government agency has ever collected. All they do is spread division and resentment in our community.
But first, those headlines today screaming about a 19% gender pay gap, well, they're not what they seem. Hearing that, on average, women earn 19% less than men seems to confirm the leftist prejudice about a society riddled with unfair discrimination. But as always with statistics, the devil's in the detail. And these statistics are not comparing apples with apples across a profession, let's say. It's about pay within a company. Now, let me explain. The data out today comes from the federal government's Workplace Gender Equality Agency. And under new laws, every company with more than 100 employees across Australia must now report their HR information to the agency. And then about this time each year, it's all published. The median pay of the man and the median pay of women in the company, and any resultant pay gap, company by company. So let's use BHP as an example. We get the median pay today for all male BHP employees. Then we get the median pay for all the women. And the difference between the men and the women is BHP's pay gap. Now, it doesn't matter if you're comparing a male senior executive with a female receptionist or a female accountant with a male cleaner. It's not about the job done by the employee and what it pays, but what people are paid by their gender. So you can see it's a pretty blunt measure. But that didn't stop the government today leaving the impression that somehow women in Australia are paid less than men simply on account of our gender.
This is added to the support we have for feminised industries. But those opposite, of course, don't even support that.
And you'll always have people on this side know that releasing that sort of data is effective. You will only find on the other side of politics anyone arguing that it's useless. The days of secretly paying women less than men are now over. We have a group opposite that has no intention of closing the gender pay gap, which explains why they have opposed each of the laws we brought into close it.
Now, despite what that minister said, let's not forget it's long been illegal in this country to pay men and women differently to do the same work. Indeed, Tony Burke, it's been outlawed since 1969. Now, typically, the media reporting of these results today said things like female workers will now learn for the first time how much less they are paid when compared to their male colleagues. Thanks, of course, to the publication of these statistics. Again, that's not right. Same job, same pay, that's the law. Instead, what these figures show is that the jobs men do and the professions men choose or predominate in tend to be better paid. Now, that could be because, as the figures indicate today, more women than men work part-time and therefore get paid less, even though they both get the same hourly rate. Or it can be that the type of industries that men predominate in compared to women, engineering, let's say, compared to childcare, explain the pay disparity. The health sector, that's a good example. Nurses, according to the data, are around 90% female. And nurses simply don't earn as much as doctors, and doctors are around 60% male. So in a straight analysis like that, women earn less than men when you compare nurses with doctors. But that's like comparing apples and oranges. If we compare a female nurse, let's say, with a female doctor, we still have a pay gap. It's not a gendered pay gap, but we still have a pay gap because the two jobs are very different. And lest anyone scream about unfair payment rates for female-dominated occupations, I reckon it's right that doctors earn more than nurses because it takes a lot longer to become a doctor than a nurse and, in many cases, more intellectual heft to qualify. Now, that's not a gendered statement. After all, there's plenty of female doctors now, around 40% in Australia. Staying with the medical profession, here's another example. Even amongst doctors, there's differences. GPs, for example, they often work part-time and consequently earn less than, say, a full-time surgeon. Well, fair enough, you say. One's part-time, one isn't, one requires higher qualifications, the other one doesn't. But that can often mean we get a statistic that says female doctors earn less than the male counterparts if she's a part-time GP and he's a full-time surgeon. See how the data can be misleading? Now, as far as I'm concerned, people who work longer hours or do more demanding jobs, well, they should have the right to be paid more based not on their gender, but on the sort of work they do. Qantas, for instance, today, it's reported as having a pay gap of nearly 40%. But the airline, which incidentally has got a female chief executive, makes a point through its head of HR, who also is female, that women are not paid less at Qantas to do the same job as men. It's just that there's a significant underrepresentation of women in highly paid roles like pilots and engineers across the airline. Now, I don't know about you, but I think that pilots should be paid more than cabin staff because it's a more demanding job. Our lives are literally in their hands, not just our lunch. And I want pilots employed on the basis of competence, not some sort of gender quota. Naturally, Qantas has got out in the media today and said that they are working hard to encourage more women into pilot and engineering roles. But the idea that any differences in gender representation is somehow due to discrimination or cultural conditioning, well, that's just wrong. Interestingly, have a look at this report about the gender pay gap in the media. The headline on Crikey reads that Sky News Australia is the only major media company in the country without a gender pay gap. It goes on. Rupert Murdoch's Sky News is the only major media organisation in Australia where women don't earn less than men, it says, according to new workplace gender equity data. Indeed, as the published table reports, the pay gap, men paid more than women, well, at Nine Media, that's 10% in men's favour. It's almost 14% at Seven Media. They don't report the salaries at the ABC for some reason, but at Sky News, it's negative 1%, meaning it's the men who have the pay gap here at Sky News, not the women, albeit it's a pretty small one. Today in the Parliament, all the usual suspects were huffing and puffing about the unfairness in these statistics, including the Teals and the Green Labor left. But I tell you, I find it bizarre to have spent a whole day watching the left convulse about gender pay gaps and what women do and don't earn, when this is the same leftist mob that can't even decide what a woman is anymore. I mean, if anyone can be a woman these days, if anyone can wake up today and decide they're Jane, not John, or John, not Jane, and change their pronouns, how relevant are these statistics anyway? If women really are being paid differently for the same work, fair enough. Get fired up because that's illegal. But to my mind, it's the cancelling of women, the theft of our women-only sports and spaces, change rooms, toilets, our language too, breastfeeding, not chest feeding, or chest feeding, not breastfeeding, reducing us to simply a person with a uterus, not a woman. Well, to me, that's the real discrimination we face today, not flawed statistics about gender pay that any competent statistician can drive a truck through. I mean, look at Sky. Hire on merit, and you know what? it might just work itself out. All right, let's get the headlines now. Sky News political reporter Trudy McIntosh.
Former Prime Minister Scott Morrison delivered an emotional final speech to Parliament. After 17 years as an MP and 4 years in the top job, Mr Morrison bids farewell to Canberra.
While politics may be an important and necessary place for service, I would also warn against it being a surrogate for finding identity, ultimate meaning and purpose in life.
He listed AUKUS and Australia's response to the pandemic among his proudest achievements.
I leave this place appreciative and thankful, unburdened by offences and released from any bitterness that can so often haunt post-political lives.
He has certainly left nothing on the field and he can be proud.
He has served our country with great distinction.
For the first time, the gender pay gap at more than 5,000 Australian companies has been revealed.
This is about transparency and accountability.
Companies with more than 100 employees forced to disclose the difference between pay for women and men. The median gap sits at 14.5%. That jumps to 19% when other remuneration, including bonuses, is included. This year's data excludes CEOs. Casual and part-time salaries have been converted to full-time earnings. Airlines among the worst performers. Qantas at just under 40%. They say that's because women are underrepresented in highly paid positions like pilots. The big banks not much better, CBA under 30%. Even companies with predominantly female customers, including the jeweller Visa, have a big pay gap. Some businesses, though, have the reverse issue. NDIS providers and private schools top that list that pay women more than men. It sparked a fight within the coalition after these comments by Matt Canavan.
Well, look, this gender pay report must be the most useless set of data that a government agency has ever collected. Young men in particular feel like they are now being discriminated against, and that's why they're going to watch the likes of Andrew Tate in droves.
Well, I disagree with those comments, but as the most senior woman in the Liberal Party, this is really important. This is something that the women of Australia understand only too well.
Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
All right, let's bring in our Sky News political editor for all that and more, Andrew Clennell. I'll ask you actually at the top of the show if I can, Andrew. We saw some remarks there from Scott Morrison, his final valedictory speech as he leaves the Parliament. How do you think he'll be remembered?
Well, as a flawed character, Peter, I have to say, I think he'll get a lot of credit for AUKUS and the initial handling of the pandemic over time. But I think all his gaffes will make him known as one of our more gaff-prone prime ministers, you know, up there with Billy McMahon even. Frankly, unfortunately for him. I mean, it's just not a black and white picture. That's what I will say. There was some good and there was some bad about Scott Morrison, and you tacked the secret ministries on as well. So it's a complicated picture. What I will say is that I think that 2019 victory, he and the people around him thought it was all them. And I've seen this mistake a few times. It's never all you. A lot of times it's about the other side too.
100%. I couldn't agree more. And I think the secret ministries are where he lost me. Let's go to Dunkley on the weekend. I mean, everyone's looking closely at that. I was out in the seat on Friday. I popped out again this morning, and I think it'll be really interesting on Saturday night. I'm watching the PM and the front bench. They're all running pretty hard on this line that the average swing against a government, they're saying, in a government-held seat is 7%. Now, Dennis Shanahan's written about this in The Australian today. He said it's actually closer to 3.5%. It says to me, with this line that's trotted out now in the last couple of days, almost verbatim by the front bench, Labor's really trying to manage some expectations, and that in itself, Andrew, is telling.
Yeah, look, Labor are worried, Peter. I said this on the weekend, and I've had a couple of conversations since which cement this for me. Labor are concerned that they could lose the seat, and I had an MP say that to me this afternoon. However, the Liberals are pessimistic. Now, you get spun by both sides, but I reckon this is pretty good mail in the sense that as things stand, the Libs need just a bit more momentum in the last couple of days, and that can come from any number of things, and they could actually get there. But at the moment, if you're saying, what's your house doing? My house is going with a narrow Labor victory.
I think I'd probably have to be in the same position, although I don't think a lot of people have clued on to the fact they've got a by-election out there. I asked a few people as I got around and they weren't aware they even had one, let alone it was Saturday. So we'll see what happens, as you say, in the last few days. Hey, I am noticing that story today in The Guardian. It's having a go at porkies told by politicians. A lot of focus, though, on the coalition, running into issues like how something like immigration is fought with in the media. They ran out the issue of the foreign criminals, of course. I noticed the Prime Minister in the Parliament attacking Advance Australia for getting out and campaigning in Dunkley. We know, of course, they were instrumental in the Voice debate. Their push in Dunkley is about this foreign criminals issue. Peter Dutton then leads question time with it. Now, that says to me this is a factor in Dunkley, and it also shows that Labor's worried about Advance Australia.
Well, why wouldn't you be? I mean, they've got a lot of money behind them and they pick on issues which play out in the outer suburbs. I mean, there is danger for the Liberals being too closely associated with a fringe group like Advance Australia, in the same way there's danger for Labor in being too closely associated with a fringe group like GetUp. So while the Liberals can take advantage, of course, of Advance Australia's campaigning, they have to keep their distance. I think that would be wise. But I think, obviously they might make the difference. Certainly if the Liberals sort of win the seat, that could be a discussion point on Saturday night. Having said that, again, I think the Liberals are just going to fall short, but we'll see. I mean, there's no doubt that if there was an alternative result, that would be a major discussion point on Saturday night. They're not out there like Get Up with their campaigners and so forth, but they raise money and they spend it on pretty effective ads. It's been interesting to see Dutton in the House. He's trying to pull these two strands together in terms of cost of living as well. So he's trying to say on the security side, they're not doing anything to apply to get these murderers behind bars. And on the other side of immigration, they've lost control of the system because they're letting 500,000 people in. That's pushing up your rents. That's meaning less housing and so forth. I think the biggest and best message that they've got in their campaign, in this by-election campaign, though, Peter, the Liberal Party, is you can send the government a message and you won't be voting them out. And that is one of the most potent messages you can ever use, because people will go, why wouldn't I do that? Why wouldn't I say to the government of the day, lift your game? You know, it's a pretty convincing kind of ad, isn't it?
Well, when I was out in Dunkley, I saw a lot of SUVs, a lot of tradies utes, a lot of trucks and, those US-style Rams and whatever out there. Yes, petrol's biting, of course it is. But I think people are picking up this vehicle emissions standard issue, featured again today in question time. And if it's not material in Dunkley, I think it's going to be a big feature leading into the next general election. And I think it's yet another huge own goal from Chris Bowen.
Yeah, well, Chris Bowen's been at the scene of a lot of accidents, and even his colleagues say that. Having said that, the government may come to some sort of arrangement with the car industry before the next election, so it may be resolved after
Yeah, but do
Dunkley.
we trust them, mate?
Look,
this is a problem. Do we trust them?
Well, if they legislate it or whatever, or regulate it, perhaps. But I think Dunkley's really interesting by-election we're covering on Saturday for a number of reasons. I think a lot of people have the view, and I think it's correct, that Aston by-election that we covered a year ago gave the government too much hubris, that result. And that's where they got into trouble on The Voice. And, of course, Peter Dutton flicked the switch straight after that to opposing The Voice. So that was a significant moment. This shapes as another significant moment. If they get a bloody nose, the government, will that pull in some of their hubris? If they get too good a result for them in a way, will that mean that hubris returns? So it affects everything in this place and in the body politic, really, this kind of type by-election. I think it'll be a fascinating contest. Now, Peter, I've been on many panels with you now, and I think since the New South Wales election, correct me if I'm wrong, in 2019, I haven't been with you when you've seen a Liberal win. So you must be hanging out for one to finally occur on Saturday night. You might get there, who knows?
Be nice to get a win for the Liberal Party in Victoria. We don't have much joy at a state level. I can't see that changing, so let's hope we get something here on Saturday night. I will welcome you all down to my set here in Melbourne. Good to see you then, Andrew. 6 o'clock, everyone, live here on Sky News. All the coverage, all the results, and we'll be talking to the team on the ground. And as I say, we know politics here on Sky. We certainly know Melbourne. Right, let's go to this breaking news. Late this afternoon, New South Wales Police have confirmed they're confident they found the bodies of Jessie Baird and Luke Davies. For more on this, let's bring in our reporter Fiona Willan. What's the latest here, Fiona?
Well, Peter, the latest is that family members will be heading to the search site tomorrow. Detectives are still there tonight. Forensic examinations still need to be carried out, but police are very confident that they have found human remains in surfboard bags. So those were located at a property at Bungonia, which is near Goulburn, and it's about 20 minutes away from a property that was being searched by police yesterday. The reason they ended up there today is because detectives went to visit the accused, Bola Condon, in jail, and they say that he provided them with information that led to that property. So they had that conversation with him at about 11 a.m. By 1 a.m, they had found what they believe are human remains. So they'll now allege the 28-year-old police officer murdered the couple in the house behind me here on Monday before transporting their bodies in those bags to that bush property on Thursday.
There's been a lot of criticism too, not just to the Police Commissioner, of course, but police more broadly, issues in relation to a police firearm and more. What else can you tell us there?
Yeah, well, I can tell you that there's going to be a review of firearm policy in the police as a result of this, because the question is, how was it that a police officer managed to have his police-issued firearm with him on a Monday? We know that he had checked it out in the days leading up to the alleged murders. He'd checked it out of a safe at work, and he had used it at an event, a work event on the Sunday, had it with him, should I say, at a rally, but he still had it with him on the Monday when he allegedly used it to commit these murders. So that's there's going to be an independent review looking into procedures around that now.
All right, well, thoughts and prayers are with the family, of course, and the friends of the two men. Thank you very much, Fiona. All right, the gender pay gap back in the headlines, as you saw. I went through all that data. Out today, of course, by the federal government's Workplace Gender Equality Agency. The agency looks at the gap between what men earn and women earn, and it's company by company. It's 19%, they say, overall, when you put bonuses, overtime and allowances into the mix. Some of the biggest companies in the country have been hit with claims of major disparities between men and women. CommBank, Qantas, Woolies, of course. But as I explained, the devil's in the detail when it comes to statistics. To discuss it more, Shadow Finance Minister Jane Hume. Minister, thank you for your time. Labor went pretty hard on this issue in question time, but I think I've stepped people through it. We're not comparing apples with apples here in these statistics, are we?
That's right, Peter. The data is flawed. There is no doubt about that. It doesn't compare men and women doing the same job. And on top of that, it compares median salaries, not average salaries. I understand that is going to change in future data sets, but right now this data does have its problems. Now, that said, is it entirely useless? There are some things that we can learn from this data. One of the things that struck me was some of those companies, and some of them that you named earlier on, make a big deal every year of International Women's Day, or they market their products to women, or they take active roles in social campaigns or political campaigns, and yet they perhaps haven't looked in their own backyard to see whether they really are meeting their own very high standards for others. So next time some of their employees accept a cupcake on International Women's Day or have to go to a breakfast of some sort, they might think twice about that. Some of the other things that I think were really interesting in this data was the fact that the unions, who have always put themselves out there as champions of women and champions in the workforce, have some pretty damning statistics that they own. But the one that really got me stuck in my craw was the fact that this data from WGEA, which has been pushed very hard and is being championed now and shouted out from the rooftops by the Minister for Women, who is also the Minister for the Public Service, doesn't include public service data. They have missed out. They've been carved out of this data. Now, 60% of the public service is made up of women, and yet somehow they've been missed from this data set. Now, I understand that again, will change, but let's be realistic here. We can use this data, certainly it shines a light, but it has its flaws.
I did make the point a bit earlier on, the media was there, but the ABC was carved out also. So I hope if they're putting the public servants there in the data next year, we're going to see the ABC in the data. I know you're a senator for Victoria. I know you've been campaigning down in Dunkley. What are the issues that are top of mind for voters there ahead of Saturday?
It's pretty easy, actually. Cost of living, cost of living, cost of living are number 1, 2 and 3. There is some white-hot anger that is being directed at the government because they feel that the government has the wrong priorities, have been focused on other things, particularly the Voice campaign last year. The vote no was pretty profound, pretty significant in Dunkley. And there's a lot of resentment towards that $450 million that was spent on the Voice campaign. But it's really the cost of living that's biting home. You know, a lot of those people have seen their disposable incomes go backwards. They're now beginning to see unemployment tick up. That's causing some social problems down there. But whether it's groceries, whether it's paying mortgages or rents, whether it's paying their electricity bills or their gas bills, the people of Dunkley are really doing it tough. Now, there are some areas that are quite affluent and are doing quite well, and they've been shielded largely from government decisions, but there's a huge mortgage belt down there, and there's also some pretty significant disadvantage. I think that they think that Labor has come with too little too late to this party, and they're going to take it out of them at the ballot box.
All right, we'll watch it very closely on Saturday night. Jane Hume, thank you. All right, after the break, Twiggy Forrest met with National Party MPs in Canberra today as he tries to get them to back more green renewables. Well, they tried to get him to drop his opposition to nuclear as well. Who came out on top? Well, I'll tell you after the break. Plus, is the corporate world finally waking up to the fact that if you go woke, you go broke, and that pandering to the left is commercial suicide? Well, I think they are after the break. Welcome back. Following the resignation of Brad Banducci, the Woolies CEO, well, it appears companies are getting the memo. You go woke, you go broke. But first, let's return to the latest intervention in the energy debate from Andrew Twiggy Forrest, who's used his opportunity at the National Press Club yesterday to demonise nuclear power, which, as Newspoll told us yesterday, the majority of Australians now support.
If we swallow this new lie that we should stop the rollout of green energy and that nuclear energy will be our fairy godmother, we will be worse off again. This misinformed, unscientific, uneconomic, plucked out of the air, thin air bulldust of nuclear policies of politicians masquerading as leaders helps no one.
Now, when he was asked about this morning, about the very valid concerns many farmers have about the rollout of renewables, well, Twiggy said, nothing to see here.
Know you're a man of the land. Do you accept the argument that wind and solar farms are taking up prime agricultural land, therefore threatening food security?
Yeah, that's absolute rubbish, mate. I mean, if we build out several Saudi Aramcos, one keeps, Saudi Arabia, 38 million people, 10 million more than us in very fine style, thank you. One does. We could build several of those out. We could send Australia green.
Joining me now, Shadow Energy Climate Minister Ted O'Brien. I'll get into the detail of what Twiggy had to say there on a couple of things in a moment, but I mean, Chris Bowen, Andrew Forrest arguing that nuclear doesn't stack up. The problem is, Ted, we can't even have a proper debate because of this moratorium, because we're prohibited as a country for having nuclear on the table. And of course, we need that moratorium lifted to get a gauge of any likely interest commercially in nuclear. That's the big impediment. This is a false debate at the moment.
Peter, you're right. And the stronger the likes of Chris Bowen and Mr Forrest go, the more you have to ask the question, if you are so confident that nuclear won't stack up, well, lift the moratorium and let's find out. I don't know why you would maintain a ban on a technology. I mean, the likes of Chris Bowen is, in fact, right now, Labor is going down the very pathway that Mr Forrest is suggesting. And look what's happening. Australians are now paying among the highest prices for electricity in the world. Our electricity grid is wobbling, And blackouts have already started, but they're only going to get worse. And by the way, we went to COP last year in Dubai saying Australia's emissions are going up. This is the pathway that Mr Forrest wants Labor to go down. It's a pathway we are going down right now and is leading Australia down the path to poverty and to a lot of hardship. There's a problem to be solved, and the coalition is going about it in a way saying we need every technology on the table to be considered, including zero emissions nuclear energy.
Well, I know Twiggy Forrest for about 20 odd years, and I've watched every personal crusade he's had beyond his business interests, clean water and beaches, renewables, Indigenous jobs, anti-slavery, every one of them. And often it's follow the fame, follow the dollars. We're told he's putting $20 billion into renewables. I mean, I reckon if there was a big government subsidy for nuclear on the table, he might like nuclear.
Peter, maybe. And look, with no disrespect to Mr Forrest and others out there who have made a lot of wealth, good on them. I'm a capitalist at heart. But we shouldn't be in Canberra focusing on how to get billionaires more money. Rather, it should be how do we save battlers money. He's got a big voice and good on him for using it. But I'm interested in the voice of the average Australian family that right now is in the midst of a cost of living crisis and is being hit time and time again by this Labor government with more taxes. A government that has a plan for energy that is only sending prices higher and hurting the average Australian battling family. They're the ones we need to represent. And so, again, Mr Forrest certainly has a right to use his voice, but it's the voices of average Australian families who I believe we need to be listening to.
Talk to me about the Coalition's plan to explore nuclear, but also the way in which nuclear, as opposed to, say, renewables, which renewables require a way to get that power to market, to get it to the homes where people want the additional power. The ability for nuclear to use a lot of the existing transmission infrastructure we have.
Peter, I think the starting point is to recognise that 32 other countries in the world have nuclear energy today, and another 50 are looking at introducing it for the very first time. And they are doing so because they face the same challenges as we do in Australia. They want to keep the prices down, they want to keep the lights on, and they need to decarbonise. Now, these new entrants, I was in Dubai, I mentioned, end of last year, looking at what the UAE did. They were able to bring in 1.4 gigawatt reactors, one a year over a 4-year period. In our region, we've got the likes of the Philippines, Indonesia, Singapore, all looking at entering the civil nuclear industry for the very first time because they know that nuclear offers that baseload power into the grid. And as you have more and more renewables coming in, well, those renewables need to be helped out. Renewables cannot do the job alone. And this is why, from the Coalition's perspective, we're looking at the electricity grid saying, OK, there's lots of renewables here, but they're not being firmed up and prices are soaring. What baseload clean energy technology is out there that can do the job? Learn the lessons from overseas, in comes zero emissions nuclear energy. And to your point, one of the benefits of considering nuclear energy for retired coal plants in those areas, those communities, is you can leverage the existing infrastructure. One of the reports I've read is a report for the Department of Energy in the United States, which is suggesting over 30% reduction in capital costs if a nuclear plant can leverage that sort of infrastructure. And if I go one step further, Peter, if you'd allow me, we're talking about Andrew Forrest before. Mm-hmm. If you talk about another billionaire, Bill Gates, and apparently Mr Forrest and Mr Gates are good mates. I think they should get together and have a chat because Mr Gates is actually with the nuclear technology he is backing. It is replacing a coal-fired power station in the state of Wyoming in the United States. And there you had 4 different communities in a state that had never had nuclear saying, pick us, pick us. Why? Because they knew it gave the union jobs certainty. You're able to transfer workforces over. These are communities that have high energy IQ. Now, some people say Australia can't do that. My view is we need to back Australians. I'm optimistic Australia can do this better than any other country if we are prepared to have that balanced mix in the grid and embrace technologies that are being embraced the world over.
Ted, I tell you what, if the government says we can build nuclear submarines in Adelaide, we can certainly have nuclear power in Australia. We just need the politics to clear away, and let's have an honest, informed debate. Ted O'Brien, thank you as always. He's full bottle, isn't he? And he's going to really push this right through to the election. Thank God. Let's get on to some business news, because it seems like the business community, certainly lobby groups at least, they've been cozying up to Labor on all manner of social causes for years. Well, it hasn't worked. They're all going backwards. They're not getting favours from Labor that they thought they might. So now they've woken up. They started to actually talk about their economic book. And today they criticised the Albanese government for its economic reform inertia. The Business Council of Australia challenging the Treasurer to cut red tape, restore the coalition-era tax to GDP cap, and implement a single payroll system in Australia to lift our stagnant productivity. Well, here, I'm joined now by business commentator at the Herald Sun, Terry McCrann. Well, hallelujah, finally they're waking up that they've actually got to get out there and argue for what's best in their company and shareholder interests, and not all these woke causes, Terry.
Well, it's very hard for me to respond in one sense, Peter, because anything that the business community tries to do to get more rational policy out of Canberra is to be welcomed. But where was the business community all the way through 2023 and all the way through 2022, when the Labor Party was embarked on all its frolics, was focused on all sorts of things that had nothing to do with making for a more productive Australia? And the business community, far from actually saying, hang on, guys, we've got to actually produce the goods before we start handing out the largesse. Where was the business community then? And when I say the business community, I'm talking about big business, from the Business Council down. No, the business community, big business, was all on the woke agenda, social issues gravy train that the government was running and putting in money to that process. So it's a bit late, and they've allowed the Albanese government to impose all these anti-business, anti-Australian policies across the board, most particularly in the industrial relations area, most particularly in the energy space, sending up the costs of business, making it very hard for businesses to operate profitably, being fundamentally anti-productivity. Now, the idea that this is all going to be turned around by trying to do something between now and the budget in May is, at the very best, a very hopeful fantasy.
Hopefully, though, Terry, hopefully we're now getting a business community that's putting some tension back into the relationship between business and the unions. So I'll use the example of government. You get a really good government when you've got a strong opposition. You have a weak opposition, you have a government that can do whatever it likes, and it usually takes the needle too far one way. So the tension between, and it didn't have the serial system in the parliament, as you know, the tension between government and opposition, if they're both at their best, is a better outcome for Australia. I think that's the same with the business community. You know, when the unions run roughshod and they get whatever they want out of Labor in Canberra, we end up worse off. When the business community kowtow and they have all their rainbow days and their Indigenous boycotts of Australia Day, we get a worser outcome. But when they stand up to the unions and the unions push back, about where you land in the middle is the national interest. And I think that's what's been missing.
Absolutely, Peter. And I mean, it's a process which requires taking a tough line, but also being prepared to compromise, knowing exactly what's going to work in the interest not only of the business but actually the workforce as well. So you have an arm wrestle with the union, you have an arm wrestle with government, and the object is to actually end up with something that works for both of you productively going forward. But when I look out there across the business landscape, I don't see the sort of business leaders we had in the 1980s and 1990s that were so important in this process. People like Hugh Morgan, people like Avi Parbo, people that were actually able to do these sorts of balancing act, but coming from a strong pro-business, pro-outcomes, pro-productivity, and that's ultimately a pro-worker, pro-individual Australian perspective.
What about this push from a lot of the big industry super funds, Cbus Super, Care Super, Host Plus? All of them are out there saying they're going to put millions and millions into affordable housing. We know, of course, I think it was Cbus that put $500 million recently into so-called affordable housing. But these are the same funds and the unions and, of course, Labor, their masters. They all oppose ordinary Australians getting hold of their super for their own home. I mean, this is pretty hypocritical.
Well, and we know the reason for that, Peter, don't we? Because if individual Australians tap their super to fund the purchase or the building of a home, that super is then not in the that money is not in the control of the union super funds, generating income for the industry super funds and other super funds, obviously, as well. So the super funds don't want to see individual Australians making decisions about their own money. They want to leave that in the hands of themselves to generate profits and to generate income for the super fund. We're all in favour of more investment in affordable housing, but it's got to be done in a way that's actually going to work and be done efficiently. I mean, the problem in this space, as we know, Peter, is there's this huge immigration inflow, which has created this extraordinary demand for housing, and secondly, all the issues which make it very hard to build houses, from land zoning issues at the state and council level to the cost of building and the cost of building supplies. So that's where we need the solutions, not by playing games with the funds that are sitting in super funds.
Just before we go quickly, Terry, on this point about affordable housing, I mean, is this housing that people will actually themselves own, like if I bought my own home with my own super money, or is this like in the Victorian government housing scheme, housing that the government owns a stake in, that eventually if I sell it, I've got to pay it back to the government? Or is it like the old housing commission model? How does it work?
Well, I can't give you the answer to that, Peter. I don't know. But ideally, we would want a mix of the two. Ultimately, the single best thing that worked for Australia through the 50s, 60s and in the 20th century was owning your own home. So that's the ultimate objective across the spectrum, not just high-income earners, not just middle-income earners. Everybody should really have a stake in owning their own home.
All right. That's my homework then. I'll find out exactly what's on the table, because I know in the Victorian example, you don't actually own it. That's the travesty of it all, and that's your biggest asset if you do. All right, thanks for your time, Terry. We'll catch up with you again soon. Let's go after the break to Kyiv, the Ukrainian capital, of course. 2 years on, ground war. 30,000 Ukrainians have been killed in the past 2 years. We'll get an update there. And more anti-Semitic hate in Melbourne. This time it is at a university by a lecturer. After the break. All right, I'll get to my panel in a moment, but this is related to housing, and this is, of course, the federal government scheme, if it passes the parliament, to take a 40% stake, so the government owns your home under its affordable housing program. Of course, they're fighting with the Greens and the Coalition. The Greens want to touch your negative gearing, but this is just from a moment ago. The Prime Minister went into the House to have a whack at the Coalition, no surprises there, but also the Greens. Have a listen.
The coalition between the Liberals and the Greens when it comes to opposing anything in housing is an unholy one. It's one designed to just keep people in their place, not do anything to improve circumstances. We on this side of the House support increasing housing supply as the key. This is good policy. It should be going through this parliament, and it is extraordinary that this coalition are combining to oppose it, but they'll be held to account for their opposition.
Now, that's a bit rich there for the Prime Minister. The Coalition wants you to own 100% of your own home, but Labor wants you to only own 60% of it. and for the government itself to own the other 40%. So it's going to be a bit testy as this goes on in the Parliament. All right, let's go to the international panel now. Sky News contributor Kosha Garda, and joining us from Ukraine, former Labor MP Michael Danby. Well, welcome to you both, Michael. Given you're in Kyiv, the war's been going on, of course, for 2 years now. 31,000 Ukrainian soldiers have been killed. Many of them we know before the war, just ordinary people, certainly not military trained, at least back then. How does it feel, or what are you being told on the ground in Ukraine?
It's 1942 Britain here, Peter. People are weary but resolute. 50 million Ukrainians want to live like us. They want to live like Europeans in an open and democratic society. And what we need to do is for Europe and America to send artillery ammunition so they can hold the Russians out and not be overrun. And this is the cheapest, the most pragmatic and the most ethical way of the world not living under the influence of Iran, Russia, China and North Korea. If we want to resist a world like that, and it therefore affects Australia, give the Ukrainians the wherewithal. They've got the biggest army in Europe and they will defend themselves and preserve themselves to a day where the Russians give up their aggression.
And the alternative is that Russia wins, and that in itself is unthinkable. Kosha, what's this with the Monash University lecturer who has access, of course, to students, glorifying the October 7 atrocities? How on earth is this lecturer still in a job?
You know, it's interesting to watch whether it's this example here, Peta, or versions of it that we saw take place at Harvard, Penn, MIT back in the States, where there's this infighting almost happening in these institutions that have traditionally been of the left, and they have the stitched together sort of patchwork coalition of people of that left. And right now you're seeing a little bit of that mess spilling out where that coalition of the fringes is fraying, and you're seeing people that are sympathetic to one cause wielding a lot of power in these institutions, and that's why, you know, these folks can speak in this way unabashedly and without fear of consequence. I think, as you saw with Harvard and all of that, it's a different system there. You've got billionaire donors that wield a lot of power, like Bill Ackman. You don't quite have that here with Monash, but there might be other measures of pressure that might be brought to them. In this day and age of social media, everything he said is out in the open, and so people can see it, and hopefully some type of pressure campaign mounts.
Hey, Michael, good news. Sweden's now been cleared. I think Hungary was the last state to vote in this, cleared to join NATO. What can we expect, do you think, in terms of Russian retaliation?
Well, the Russians can't do much. Sweden, like Finland, is a very well-armed society. I don't think they have to get to 2%. I think they're already there. The Russians can huff and puff, but the question is will the Ukrainians be overrun with the huge preponderance of Russian ammunition? In my view, Peter, the fate of the world hangs on what happens in the American Congress in the next few weeks, whether they vote for that aid package for Ukraine or not. And I think Putin has waged a very successful full-spectrum warfare, using information warfare in the United States to deny the Ukrainians the military aid that will make up for the fact that he hasn't been able to win on the battlefield.
We'll go to the United States now. Kosha, Nikki Haley, of course, losing the primary in her home state of South Carolina. She was crowing about the fact that she got 40% of the vote. But let's remember, in South Carolina, anyone, even a Democrat, can vote in Republican primary. I mean, it could have been a whole lot of anti-Trumper types voting just to keep her alive. I'm told she's still got some money coming in. Is she going to keep going? What do you think?
She seems to be on that path of sticking with it. It is highly unusual because a couple of records were set in South Carolina. One is that Trump actually received double the number of votes in a presidential primary in history in any state. And so that's, you know, a counter dynamic to the point she's raising. And then the other point is the margin of defeat by a home state candidate. This was the highest record, 20 points. It's never happened to somebody who was the governor of that state. So, that just puts it in sharper contrast, the fact that she is sticking with it. One of her biggest donors, the Koch brothers fundraising group, did declare that while they support her personally, thought she was the better candidate, they've decided she has no more path to victory and they've pulled out. I don't know if that's one of several dominoes to fall, because once the funding dries up, it'll be harder for her. But I think, she's doing it for any number of reasons, to stay in the limelight for future career prospects, to sort of be the fallback option if something were to happen to the Trump himself or the campaign, or who knows what else. There are some more cynical people out there who think that she's in there as controlled opposition to muddy up the race, but we can only speculate. We don't know.
We'll be talking about this all the way through till November. Thank you both. Stay safe, please, Michael, in Ukraine. We'll talk to you again next week. All right, that's it for me. Tomorrow night at 6, of course, up next, Steve Price.